This is a hat trick
podcast.
Oh, lovely.
Hi, Armand.
Hello, Jimmy.
So this week we're talking about love. What is love? And you're going to take us through Plato's Symposium, which includes different people's views on love, including, of course, famously Socrates, because Plato always wrote through the mouth of Socrates.
And while Socrates famously said, "I know that I know nothing," he actually tells us what he knows about love in the Symposium. And he says he learned it from a clever woman. Mm-hmm. And we're going to be talking about the identity of the woman who told him that.
Aha, okay, so there's a mystery. And I guess if we've got the word love and Plato, we're going to be discussing about Platonic love, aren't we?
Yes, that's right.
And where that comes from.
Yes.
All right, so let's kick off. What on earth is a symposium?
Literally, a symposium means a drinking party in Greek, symposion. So a symposium is the most common way in which Athenians got together and talked about things, drank. But in this particular drinking party, the participants decide that they will not drink for various reasons. Instead, they will have discussions in praise of love. Eros in Greek, eros, from which we get erotic, of course. So you have, in the course of this particular dialogue of Plato, it's called a dialogue even if there aren't two people speaking, you have 7 speeches. There are 5 from various participants in the symposium, symposiasts as they're called, and then 1 quite important central speech by Socrates. And then you have an eruption into the party by a young man, Alcibiades, who then gives the longest speech in the whole symposium, in which he says love is essentially the person that he loves, who is Socrates.
So we have Plato putting words into Socrates' mouth. And of course, we only know about Socrates because of the work of Plato. He was, in a way, Socrates was the mouthpiece for Plato's ideas and obviously was taught by Socrates. Is that not the case?
Yes, so Plato was his pupil. And as you say, we essentially know about Socrates not from his own writings, but from those of others. Plato is the most expansive about Socrates' philosophical thinking. And then Plato writes 30-odd dialogues, all of which he puts into Socrates' mouth, these doctrines, and says this is what Socrates taught. We don't have any written philosophy from Socrates himself. Actually, it's not quite true to say we don't have nothing written by Socrates. We do have snatches of his poetry, interestingly.
Any good?
Well, only a line or two, but there's one line which says that the person who's best at dancing is also best at fighting. And it shows that Socrates was a man of action, not just a man of thinking. Yeah. He was, as we know from the Symposium, an effective fighter in Athens' battles.
When you're invited to a symposium, were you expected to turn up with something like this? I mean, because when if you're invited to go out for drinks with friends these days, you're not thinking, oh my God, one of them's going to turn around and say, well, what are you thinking about this philosophically, or what are you thinking about this poetically? I mean,
yes.
Who are these people? Are they elites? That obviously
yeah. I mean, essentially, there must have been symposia at all levels of society, but the ones that we know about are the elites, the playwrights, the doctors, the lawyers, the people who have very strong claims to intellectual interests, and they would have got together with the expectation of having a good time intellectually.
Right.
There was a lot of drinking. There were drinking games, including trying to spit at spittoons and things of that kind. So,
classy stuff.
Yeah, there wasn't necessarily all very high flown.
Yeah.
But there was a tradition of, we call it consequences, where you say something and then you pass it on to someone else. That game, but they would have done it with poetry.
So Plato uses this very usual, commonplace format, if you like, in order to unpack a philosophical argument about love.
Yes. So Plato, as you say, uses it as an opportunity to present various different facets of what people in his society might have thought love was about. So the first speaker says, Eros makes us noble in relation to the person we love. We would be prepared to lay down our life for that person. The second speaker then says, but there are 2 types of love. There's committed relationships and there's pure sexual attraction. And he makes this distinction between good and bad love, essentially. The third speaker is a doctor, and he says, love is a force of harmonization in the body. For example, you need your body to love good things, healthy foods and so on, and to reject bad ones. But he says it also relates to music, where you have opposites, high and low notes, and they have to come into harmony. And it relates to nature as a whole, the seasons. You have hot, cold, you have all sorts of things, but you need a harmony. So he sees it in abstract terms. Then the playwright who gives the speech says love is a creative force. It makes you be a poet or a musician or a speaker. So they're all coming up with different individual notions of what love is, but they're saying love is to be praised for all those reasons. And the most interesting and central speech, one of the central speeches, I would say, is that of the comic playwright Aristophanes. And that's the one I think that is most memorable for most of us today, because it rings a bell. And Aristophanes, he's a comedian, so he's going to say something funny. And what he says...
And by the way, in my experience, not always the case.
True indeed. But Plato assumes, I think, that Aristophanes would have said something funny. So he put something funny into his mouth. And what he says was, originally human beings were double what we are today. We had 2 faces, 4 arms, 4 legs. We were great roly-poly creatures. And we were terribly self-satisfied. We thought we had it all. We ignored the gods. And in fact, we even tried to, at one stage, scale the heavens in order to prove our strength and our brilliance. And so Zeus, the chief of the gods, decided that he would cut us down to size. What he said was, I'm going to slice these human beings in half so that there'll be more of them to give us sacrifices, but also they'll be weaker.
And there's a female part and a male part.
So what you have is 2 halves coming together, and they could be lesbians, they could be homosexual, or they could be man and woman.
Oh, so then you would, if you were split in half from another, I'm a man split from another man, I would then be in search of another man.
Yes.
That's very modern.
Very modern, yes. Very open to any kind of relationships between the different sexes. And the idea that Aristophanes then says, once these original humans, these roly-poly creatures, were split in half, and Apollo had been asked by Zeus to smooth down the wrinkles,
right?
So they become us.
Apollo was a kind of celestial cosmetic surgeon.
Indeed he was, yes. Then the slicers of humans were desperate to find their other half and to cling onto them. Right. But eventually the other halves died, so they keep looking for the thing that will make them whole again, and that is love. It is our desperate desire to find our other half. So that is what Aristophanes says love is.
It's a nice theory.
Yeah.
It's a very memorable image.
I mean, one of the problems with finding someone who is exactly like you, as it were, is that you're never going to go anywhere with it. You're not going to grow in such a relationship. No. So, in a way, what the Symposium goes on to suggest is that you need to find someone who is going to help you to grow and develop and become more than what you currently are. So the idea that you're just finding your original wholeness, which is what Aristophanes' image suggests, is something that is rejected overall by the later speakers in the Symposium. What you're looking for is
because it's just basically a retreat into unconsciousness. It's a
retreat into almost a sort of infantile stage, where you're just, the very stage of self-satisfaction which the gods decided the human beings needed to be weakened from. So the idea of going back to that, it's a bit too regressive. And what Socrates goes on to talk about is striving for something where you recognise that you have a lack. So, I mean, that's an interesting point about love. Love isn't self-satisfied, because otherwise it wouldn't be striving for something.
He talks about the ladder of love, doesn't he?
Yes, so he says...
I love that expression.
Yeah, so
that
you
should
start...
be a song, The Ladder of Love.
Probably is. But
you should write it on.
He says that he learned the truth about love. So he makes a distinction. The earlier speakers are praising Eros, the god of love. He says, I am going to tell you the truth about love. And this is odd in itself, because Socrates is famous for saying, the one thing I know is I know nothing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if he's now saying, well, I do know something, and what I know is about love, you have to ask yourself why. he gives us the answer. He says, I learned it from a clever woman, non-Athenian woman, he says, and her name was Diotima. And there's no evidence at all for this Diotima person other than her presence in the dialogue. And so it's been assumed that this is a fiction that Plato has created, and he's put into Socrates' mouth the idea that he's learned the truth about love from some fictional person. I asked myself, well, what does Diotima mean? And it's very clear. We have known as classicists it means honoured by Zeus, Diotima in Greek. And Zeus was the nickname, very common and popular nickname, of Pericles, who was the leading citizen of Athens. And he famously honoured his wife or mistress, Aspasia of Miletus. So honoured by Zeus is already pointing towards her. And in the Symposium, Socrates says, I learned it from this woman who was very clever. And among other things, when the Athenians were sacrificing to avert the plague, she managed to postpone it for 10 years. And this is a very, very precise and curious thing that she says, and nobody has really got to the bottom of it. But if you think 10 years before the Great Plague of Athens in 430 to 29, Pericles had conducted a campaign on the island of Samos, supposedly at the behest of Aspasia, his then partner, in which he behaved with real brutality. He had the opposing generals crucified, and he threw their bodies out unburied. Now that should have led to a plague in 440 to 439, because that sort of behaviour must have been seen as the kind of thing that would lead to divine punishment. It didn't happen. It happened 10 years later, and Pericles died from the plague. So I think what Plato is telling us is that there was a woman at that period, and that woman can only have been Aspasia, this woman honoured by Pericles, honoured by Zeus, Diotima. And so he says that is the person who taught Socrates what he claims to know about love. And he says what she said to him was, you start with sexual attraction. You've got to love an individual body. But then you start loving lots of different bodies, and you realise that what you're loving is the thing that those different bodies have in common, which is their beauty.
Yes.
And eventually, in relation to that beautiful thing, you become creative. So that's bringing together some of the previous speakers' ideas of the creativity of love. You either create a baby or you create ideas.
So he talks about the pregnancy of the body.
Yeah. You're pregnant with ideas or with...
Or the soul, yeah.
Yeah, your soul is pregnant. Or you want to perpetuate yourself in relation to the thing that you find beautiful in some way. So it's both intellectual and physical. And then eventually, according to Diotima, though I suspect that this is what Plato puts into the mouth of Socrates, giving us Diotima's doctrine, so I don't think this is anything Socrates would have said, eventually you come to realise that love is a vision of beauty itself, which is very high-flown metaphysical stuff. This is something that Plato develops as his own philosophical idea, that the world as we have it is a somewhat degraded form of what reality really is, which are these forms of beauty and justice and virtue. And that is what the lover ultimately wants to see in view of this highly metaphysical idea. At the top of the ladder, you have a vision of beauty itself. It's very hard to know exactly what that means for your average person, but the problem is the doctrine in the Symposium goes much further than anything that she could have said. It goes into Plato's own ideas of the form of beauty. So although he puts that into her mouth, he can't say this was Aspasia's doctrine. That's why I think he gives her this pseudonym. And it has misled people for centuries into thinking that Diotima is separate from Aspasia. Yes, she isn't Aspasia, she's modelled on Aspasia, but there is independent evidence for Aspasia giving talks in salons about love and relationships. So when Socrates says, I used to go and hear her talk about love, surely he's talking about a real woman.
Wow.
But what she actually then goes on to say in the Symposium is not what Aspasia can have said. And this is the point at which Alcibiades bursts into the party drunk, and he says, what are you all doing? Oh, you're talking about love. I'll tell you all about love. And he bursts into a speech about not love as an abstract idea, but love as the person you love.
So Alcibiades burst in.
Yeah, and he says Socrates is an embodiment of love. Socrates saved his life in battle. So that goes back to Phaedrus saying that love is something that inspires you to noble deeds. Socrates had incredible fortitude. He could walk through ice barefoot. So we learn a lot about Socrates' military experiences. He had fortitude, he could bear hunger and cold and so on. He was essentially health personified, so this goes back to the doctor's view that love is somehow a harmonization of everything. So you're getting a lot of stuff wrapped up in the embodiment of Socrates in the speech of Alcibiades. And he says Socrates outwardly is not good looking, he's ugly, he's like a satyr, but inside there is beauty. So there's also this idea that love is lacking in some way. If you pursue it, you'll find the true beauty of it within.
And also Alcibiades introduces the carnal element, doesn't he? Because he talks about trying to have sex with Socrates, doesn't he?
So Alcibiades was this famously beautiful young man. And we're talking about a situation in ancient Athens where amongst elites it was generally accepted that older men could have relationships, not necessarily sexual, but possibly sexual, with younger ones. Yeah. So we would call it pederasty, and we very much frown on that idea. But for them, the idea was that the younger man would have a relationship with an older man and learn social and intellectual skills by having that relationship. And it might become carnal. And the speech of Pausanias, the second speech, is one where he makes this distinction very clearly, and he says there's a good and a bad love. The good love is if you accept that you are taking on a young man as your mentee, and you're going to draw out the good things in their mind. If it's just for the sake of the body, that is really bad. So we have to assume that there was homoerotic relationships which did involve carnal love, but the dialogue, as we have it, tries to draw a distinction between that. In fact, later in another dialogue, the Laws, Plato actually would legislate against having this kind of sexual relationship with younger men. But in this dialogue, it is accepted, and very unusually, Alcibiades says he, as the beautiful young man, tried to seduce Socrates as the ugly older man because he loved his mind so much. He admired him so much, and he assumed that was what he wanted. And he said he lay with him under his cloak all night, but Socrates didn't make a move on him because Socrates was only interested in helping him develop and improve. So Alcibiades tells this story about Socrates' unusual reluctance to have sex with a beautiful younger man, and that, of course, is where we get this idea of Platonic love.
Right, I'm going to ask you that. I mean, because it's such a buzzword, I love you platonically. It's almost become a cliche. So can you just unpack what is platonic love?
So platonic love is when you have the possibility of actually having sex with someone, but you choose not to. So your love is non-sexual. But it's very important that the element of sex could be there. It's not like you don't want to, or that there is no desire, or there's no possibility of desire. There are all those things, but you choose to avoid it. So it's not the same as, say, loving your grandma, where, of course, it's not going to be a sexual love, but it's not platonic love. Platonic love is specifically if it is for someone with whom you could have a sexual relationship but choose not to in some way.
And what are the various stages that you go through in order to get to that point where you can feel sexual feelings for the other person and think, actually, no, that's a more degraded love for me. I want to have a platonic relationship with this, where we both explore our souls, our psyches in a way, and we achieve a greater understanding of the other and have a platonic relationship.
Yes, I mean
that's a weird concept these days. If you think about Tinder.
It is weird, yes. A lot of the sexuality in the modern world is very basic and very carnal.
Yeah. And quick.
But I think that the notion of committed relationships, there has to be something else going on. there has to be some kind of meeting of minds, some sense that you're learning and growing in relation to someone else. Otherwise, it tends to become a little sterile and static, doesn't it?
Yeah, it reminds me of that. You see that film As Good As It Gets with Jack Nicholson?
Oh, yes.
Where he plays this man who's obviously got some terrible OCD, and he has a relationship with a waitress played by Helen Hunt. They both won Oscars for it. And he's a very troubled guy, but he thinks this is the person that gets him. We're talking about this the other half thing. They have a terribly tumultuous relationship, and they're in a restaurant. They just had a terrible row, and it's a bit awkward. And he just says, I'm back on my medication. And she says, oh, why? He said, because you make me want to be a better man. Now, I was in a cinema with my wife, and every woman in the cinema went, because that's what you want to hear, is when I'm with you, you pull out of me my best bits. You make me want to be better than who I am. And I would say that if you're in a long-term relationship, the person you meet is yourself again and again and again. And the person you have to ask yourself, the question is, is this something I need to carry on with, or can I ditch this in order to make my relationship better? And so there's a kind of calling to do more work. That's what I'm saying about love isn't a feeling, love's hard work.
Well, I think make me want to be a better person sums up to some extent what Plato is telling us in the Symposium. At least by the time Alcibiades comes in, it's about how do you relate to someone whom you love and who loves you?
Yeah.
What's that about? Now, I mean, there is a historical irony, because Alcibiades famously became a traitor to Athens. He went over to the Spartan side during the war when Athens was fighting Sparta. And Plato's readers would have known this. And Alcibiades actually says in the course of his speech, I was always good when I was in your presence, Socrates, but when I wasn't, I strayed. So the question might be, has Socrates failed in his love for Alcibiades? Because if he has to be with him in order for Alcibiades to be a good person, what does that mean when Alcibiades wants to go off and do his own thing and then acts in a treacherous way towards Athens? It's a vexed situation that we're left with, I think.
I suppose a good mentor, and you must see this in your day job where you're teaching young people, is the role of the mentor with the young person. You can probably see something in a young person which they can't see yet. And so your job is to educate, to use the Latin word, to bring out and to show the person, look, this is what you have. But at that moment, it's their responsibility to take that and internalize it. And what you're saying is Alcibiades is what they say these days in modern psychological parlance, codependent on Socrates. When he's around, he's fine, but when he's not around, he misbehaves.
Yes.
So he hasn't gone the full journey.
He hasn't gone the full journey. And at the same time, this is the longest part of the Symposium, the bit that we're left with. So the question that scholars have asked for eons is, what does Plato want us to take away from the Symposium? Because the big speech that Socrates gives in the middle about the ladder of love and seeing the vision of beauty is very much undercut by this last section in which Alcibiades tells us about Socrates, but then tells us, I myself haven't really learned enough from that relationship to be good.
But I rather like that. I think that, in a way, that ambivalence is the truth, isn't it?
I mean, some people have said the centre of the dialogue where Socrates gives us the ladder of love doctrine is the one that Plato wants us actually to believe. But I think the way that in ancient Greek drama, for example, the last person to speak is the one that has got it right. In rhetoric, they seem to have this formula where the last person has the last word. And here, Alcibiades very clearly does have the last word. And so Plato must know that we're going to be leaving on that note. But I think one of the things Plato clearly wants us to do is to go away and think about what love means to us. So very often this dialogue is called a protreptic. It means an invitation to think philosophically about love. And it certainly does that.
So they're all lying on their couches,
and
Alcibiades burst in and kind of undercut what the highfalutin ideas of his mentor Socrates by being a bit louche, a bit drunk, and a bit honest, really. A bit kind of, well, this is what human beings are really like. And is that it? Is that how we're left?
Yes, so at the end of that, what we read is, this speech of Alcibiades created much amusement at his frankness, because he seemed to be still in love with Socrates. Socrates said, I think you're sober after all, Alcibiades, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to conceal the motive of your entire speech by ingeniously disguising it in this way. You slipped it in at the end as though it was an afterthought, as though the point of the whole speech hadn't been to make trouble between me and Agathon. So he takes it as a sort of personal thing. He jocularly suggests that he says, you did it because you think that I should love you and no one else, and that Agathon, this is the host of the party, should be loved by you and no one else, but you haven't got away with it. So it becomes a bit of a jocular thing. I know why you're giving that speech, to try and make trouble between me and
So Socrates does have the last word in a way.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there's a bit of joshing,
Yeah.
Changing places, and, I want to sit next to this one, and I want to be next to that one. And then Plato says, Agathon got up to lie down beside Socrates, and suddenly a large group of revellers came to the front door. They found it open, and all order was abandoned. Everyone was forced to drink vast amounts of wine.
Ah, so they all got pissed in the
So
end.
they all get drunk. Well, actually, famously, Socrates drinks into the early morning and doesn't get drunk, because nobody ever saw Socrates drunk. This is a point that is made. He could hold his liquor like no one else.
All right. Good. Well, God, I found that was quite exhausting, actually.
Love is.
Love is exhausting. Now, that's a T-shirt, so I'll see you next week.
See you then. Thank you.
It's All Greek and Latin to Me is presented by Armand and Jimmy Mulville. The producer is Diggory Waite, and the executive producer is Claire Broughton. It's All Greek and Latin to Me is a hat-trick podcast.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to give a mention to Classics for All. Classics for All is a charity, and what we want to do is provide access to the classics to as many state school pupils as possible, alongside training teachers who don't actually have to have any previous training in the subject. They hope that they make classics a sustainable part of the school curriculum. If you want to find out more about this fantastic charity, go to the website. It's www.classicsforall.org.uk.